Howard Becker's life is in a way a kind of prototypical example of the argument that I want to make. What sociologists learn from music. Sociologists are very often secret musicians. And there's something about that that I want to use as a kind of beginning point to think about not only what music teaches sociologists, but also in a sort of double movement, what also sociology might have to contribute to the conversation about music itself. It couldn't be a better place than to be talking to you here with the piano, piano's just next door, and harpsichords, and to be in this beautiful, beautiful building. I was kind of lost for words when I walked in here this morning, thinking what an incredibly ideal place it is to share some of these arguments and reflections. So the connection between musical craft and practice and sociological thought goes right back to the beginnings of the sociological story. W.B. Du Bois, who writes this incredibly important book, The Soul of the Black Folk, had a pretty impressive voice. So too did the slightly chubby, happy-looking character next door to Du Bois, which is actually Max Weber as a younger man. Weber himself has a fairly austere reputation within our sort of world of ideas. But both Weber and Du Bois shared a love of music. They also shared a friendship. It's a really interesting story. Du Bois invites Weber to the United States, where Weber experiences not only the kind of white Presbyterian music of the white Presbyterian church, but also the gospel and spiritual music of the black Pentecostal church. Weber writes this very famous Sociology of music, actually in 1911, and it was going to be included as part of a much larger, is one of his important larger works, but it wasn't included and only published 10 years later. Weber, in many respects, thought that the story of music was similar to the story of modernity and rationalization, that rather than with the elaborate forms of notation and technological sophistication of Western music, rather than enhancing hearing, it constrained hearing and listening. The rationalization of music as organized sound for Weber in the West is a story of restraint or constraint. Du Bois himself writes brilliantly about the value of music in that classic book which was published in 1903, The Soul of Black Folk. You know, it's interesting in telling that the key of those arguments begin, each chapter has a small passage of a melody from a spiritual. Du Bois writes, "What are these songs and what do they mean? I know little of music and can say nothing in technical phrase, but I know something of men, and knowing them, I know that these songs are the articulate message of the slave to the world." The articulate message of the slave to the world, carried in sound, carried in the voice, are the beginnings, the embodiment of that song of freedom. Now Du Bois, I think he's actually downplaying the fact that he could read music. He was in choirs, he was a member of the Mozart Society at Fisk, where he studied. You know, he has this formation that starts in Great Barrington in the northeastern United States, and then he goes south to study in Nashville at Fisk, where he encounters the black church and the way in which both the church and the music of the church become a vehicle to express that articulate message. So, you know, the story of the relationship between musical life and sociology goes right back to the beginning. And it isn't always a story of enhancement. found out recently that one of the other early figures, or founding figures of sociology, Emil Durkheim, had a less than enthusiastic relation to music. In fact, Durkheim was deeply sceptical about the arts in broad terms. He thought because artistic practice worked with the imagination, that actually it undermined the new science of sociology's commitment to rationalism and realism. And there's part of this story which really manifests around his partner, Louise Durkheim. Durkheim is often characterised as a dedicated family person, a good father. He was devastated by the loss of his son in World War I, which many attribute to his early death at 59. Other part of Durkheim's story, which is less widely known, is that he forbade Louise, his wife, who was a pretty good piano player, to play the piano in their home. And after Durkheim's death, after his passing, there's his grave in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris. All the neighbours remember is that they could hear is the sound of the piano. So this sort of hidden story, I think, is a clue and an invitation and I think a provocation. So here's a few musical sociologists. It's not a quiz, although sometimes I have a bit of a weakness for quizzes. So some of you will recognise Theodore Adorno, playing the piano there, who also was a composer, and I was going to play a little bit of Adorno's music to start with, but actually I thought maybe Howard Becker's Misty was a better place. Evelyn Rupert, who you'll hear from, Anna Bull, who's also was one of the people involved in this project that I've been doing. Emma Jackson, the great Stuart Hall, who you're going to hear from in a minute. Kath Larkin, Paul Gilroy, Ernst Bloch, Roland Barthes, like to play the piano, and Joy White, who's written a brilliant book about race in the city and managed Grimax before she became established as a sociological researcher. Now, the article that relates to my talk today is a study of almost 30 sociological researchers and theorists, some of whom are in the room, who have a commitment to music in the broadest terms. So that commitment to music includes a whole range of different genres, from dancehall reggae to chamber music, to orchestral chamber music, as well as a whole range of different people at different age stages and sociological backgrounds. One of the sources or touchstones in this argument is the writing of Antoine Hignon, whose book, La Passion Musicale, or The Passion for Music, makes a really suggestive argument. And he says that music actually is a form of sociology. It was actually Nick who put me onto this book. So learning music involves a kind of sociological practice. If you think about it, the training in genres or in forms of knowledge, learning to read music, learning to embody the practice of making music. So for Hignon, making music involves learning a kind of cultural practice. So he says provocatively, music is a form of sociology. Now I wanted to sort of be inspired by that idea and extend it and turn it the other way to say that perhaps sociology is a form of music. And I want to begin. My first musical sociologist is Howard Becker. He writes this very important book, Outsiders, in the early 1960s, which I think almost single-handedly recruited a legion of young cultural rebels, largely because I think one of the essays in there, which is about how to become a marijuana smoker, resonated. Maybe resonate is not the right word. But here he is in the 1940s performing with Bobby Lane in the taverns of Chicago. During World War II, when the jazz musicians of Chicago were being enlisted on both sides of the colour line into the US Army, there was a dearth of musicians. And Becker found himself as a 15-year-old, can you imagine, earning probably more money, well, absolutely certainly more money than a graduate teacher at the University of Chicago, playing jazz in taverns. And in a way, that world, the world of the tavern, became a place for the young sociologist to train his curiosity, to notice things from the bar stool. When he came, of the piano that is, when he came to visit us in Goldsmiths, we had a wonderful conversation publicly about that past. What I'm going to do through the course of my talk is, rather than me read out quotations, I'm going to let you hear the voices of these sociologists, or some of them at least. So here's Howard Becker talking about the things that he learned at the piano in those taverns in Chicago.
Well, it did a lot of things for me, Les. One thing is it made me completely aware of the fallacies that are embedded in conventional thinking. I mean, when I read anything, when I read Talcott Parsons talking about American values, and I thought, which American values that he talked about are being enacted when I see the owner of the club give $50 to a policeman? I mean, because I would see that, like I was worried. I remember vividly working in a bar on 63rd Street in Chicago. I was playing with a trio, and we played in this place, 8 hours a night. And it was run by a guy who was a hoodlum. I mean, he wore expensive suits, and he was well-spoken. But he was. That's the kind of business it was. And these guys were, first of all, they were breaking the federal law on alcohol taxes, because their entire stock practically consisted of a set of empty whiskey bottles and several cases of something called Old Philadelphia and a funnel. And when they emptied the Seagram 7 bottle, they took it in the back and put the funnel in and opened up a bottle of Old Philadelphia and filled it up. Well, okay, that's the kind of business it was. During the day, they booked horse race bets. So one night, Joe, the owner, they had what they called dice girls. They had a sort of game that you played with. It's too complicated to explain, not worth it, but the girl would throw the dice and you would make bets. And it was all, chicken feed. I mean, it was like, you bet $1. Yeah. So this one guy was a little drunk, and he was pestering one of the girls, who happened to be the girl that Joe was romancing. And she finally signaled for Joe to come over and get him off her back. So he did. He pulled him away, took him into the men's room, and beat him up with a blackjack. Yeah.
What is blackjack?
It's a sap.
Yeah.
So then he dragged him out of the bathroom, and he was bleeding and a little groggy. And then Joe called the police and had this guy arrested for disturbing the peace.
Who'd just been assaulted in the toilet.
Right. And then he gave the cops some money. So I mean, that's my experience of it. Not that all American values are like that, but that has to be accounted for.
It would make you think about the relationship between norms and deviance.
Well, it made me think, you know, it's a ludicrous way to talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't you see, you know, maybe Howard Becker's biggest idea was around labeling theory. It's actually those who have the power to impose and make a label stick is how the difference between norms and deviance get defined. So paying off a cop, normal, having someone take one of the patrons into the men's toilet and beating the hell out of them with a club, that's normal. Then calling the police, it just depends who's doing the definition of norms and deviance, right? I just thought there's such a kind of that insight that I do think, and it didn't come just from that experience, but you could see then that the young sociologist starts to become slightly suspicious of figures like Talcott Parsons, who would talk about American values as universals that applied in all cases. That experience in the taverns of Chicago, it was evident it's about actually those who have the power to define and draw that line where those norms are imposed. Now, so in a way, I suppose the invitation, and I know there's some not pretty impressive, some world-class musicians in this room, as a sort of thinker and writer, being engaged in a world of value and values beyond the academy, I think is a huge resource, and it comes through, I think, time and time again in the kinds of things that the people that I sat and listened to were enriched by. That invitation to go out, as Harvey March would once say. But you know, it's important for us in terms of our craft of thinking about society and telling about society to be engaged in those alternative worlds of value. Now, many of the stories in this piece are also about limitation, or wanting to be a musician, wanting to make it as a musician and never quite making it. And my next musical sociologist reflects a little bit on that, the post-colonial theorist Paul Gilroy. And you'll hear, when I play this extract, the whirring of a kind of a whirring sound in the background, and that's a faulty valve on his very expensive and beautiful Carl Rambler guitar amp. He's a very accomplished guitarist, and in a way, Paul's sensibility, I think, is the way he writes about culture and history and memory, particularly in the context of the black diaspora, the African diaspora, is shaped by his feel for making music. When you visit Paul in his home, he's never more than 3 or 4 feet away from either a vintage Telecaster or one of the very high-end handmade instruments that he has a particular weakness for. Here he is, talking about the gift of music.
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that whatever, my dabblings in music and my experience of playing and my sort of ritual of playing and the conversation that I have with people who are musicians who are not academics about the world has enriched my understanding of what culture is and how culture functions. And I think that music is not something we consider to be a representational medium, in the sense that all the other things that we love and cherish about cultural work and cultural making culture, in art, in literature, in poetry, in painting, they're all about the world. There was the world and then there's the representation. But with music, there's no world. The music is the thing. It's not about representing something else. And I think as I got more confident about my understanding of the relationship between music and utopia, I began to see that there were all sorts of ways in which I'd I brought things in from my relationship with music as organised sound that just wouldn't have been there otherwise. It's hard actually to begin to build an inventory of resources that come into one's life in that way. And the kind of map you make of thought, the map you make of history and critical thinking is very different if you are self-conscious about the fact that you're working with things that have been supplied to you by people who've had that struggle in their own lives, you know. You know, I mean, obviously there are people that really influence my understanding about what culture is and how it works. And it's odd to be forced by your own development to have to reflect on the fact that they were musicians and therefore they thought about what they were doing in a certain way. And the most obvious and most important of those people is really Ralph Ellison, actually. And I think now someone went to the trouble of editing together a little volume of Ralph Ellison's writings on music. And he is in my head in a sort of special place because I think he's someone who became a writer because they couldn't really cut it as a musician. So I'm sympathetic to him on that level, although he's obviously a much better musician than me. And I think that sort of acquaintance with your limitations as a musician, in his case, has really affected his understanding of what words and text might bring to the table. And so there's something about Ellison in that. And then of course there are other people like Bloch and Adorno who are similarly people who, you know, have a musical life and write music and produce music, and to whom the experience of musicking is an integral part of their critical commentary on everything else about culture and social life, everything else. And in particular the question of utopia and how utopias become apparent to us, how they are able to enter into our lives and orient.
Musicking is a place not only to have a skill that transcends one that is made from words and books, but also as a place to work out the unfolding of culture and social relations themselves. It's a kind of resonance with a point that Howard Becker makes about a model of culture which is really begins on the bandstand and the conundrum of how four jazz musicians can come together in a restaurant, Phil will recognise this, and play for 3 hours without knowing, never met before, maybe don't even know all the same songs, but somehow the summoning of common stocks of knowledge. Harry Becker writes this extraordinary book, I'm sure some of you have read it, called Do You Know? Well, you might not know that song, but you might know another one that's like it. And how that process of assembling culture interactively and from stocks of knowledge becomes a model for understanding culture itself in the here and now. But I think what Paul Gilroy points to is also it becomes a space to not only reflect on what is, but what is emerging and what is to come, to signal more Ernst Bloch's principle of hope, that which is becoming, that which is not made yet, but is that which is emerging. There were other people that I met through doing this labour of love who used music in much more sort of direct, methodological ways. And one of my favourite stories in the article is from Kath Larkins, who is a pretty accomplished singer-songwriter. She performed, I think, at Manchester Gay Pride as a young person in front of like 10,000 people. She's a songwriter, really. Her areas of research are really around issues of childhood and young people's experiences. She did an incredible project on Gypsy Travellers and the experience of those young people. And in the midst of doing this project, she realised that so much of what was important to the young people she was listening to and attending to couldn't be spoken. Couldn't be spoken. There was a lot of sort of imaginative movements of imagination which were required to find those points of resonance that weren't explicitly narrated. I'm sure, you know, the researchers in the room have had that experience. You know something is there, but there isn't a story that can be told that is amenable to transcription. You know, I don't know if any of you had this experience, but I remember as a PhD student, if I didn't get it on tape and I couldn't transcribe it, it didn't exist, but it felt like it did. So what Kath did in the midst of this was that she used her capacity as a songwriter to take the things that she had a feel from in the relationship she had with these young people and write songs as almost like imaginative exercises. And this is what she says about it, which I think is such an interesting thing. So the songs don't represent the experience of her participants, but they become an imaginative space to assemble a different kind of texture of understanding. So Kath writes, it gives you permission to imagine, fill in the gaps. You can take what you've heard and allow yourself to experience whatever it makes you feel, then try to put it into music. I can feel all this. It's not my experience. If I try to connect to it through music, then I'm connecting to it in a way in which I'm being my most honest self. Then I'm most open to understanding what it might be. It's kind of resonant as well with one of our colleagues in Glasgow, Fergus McNeill, and the project that he's been involved in, the Unbound project, which basically does songwriting workshops inside prisons. The songs then move out of the prisons and connect with families beyond it. But the songs themselves become kind of problem-solving devices for both the writers and those who listen. So there are sort of, music in this sense becomes a kind of methodological resource or tool. Forgive me, Nick, I didn't know you were going to turn up today, but I'm really happy to have you. So Nick Pryor also writes in his fantastic book at the end about a project you did with, it seems bizarre me talking about this, Nick, and you're sitting right there, about a project, a digital project, writing project, I suppose, creating project with a group of students called Identities. And it really caught my imagination reading this, the end point of this book. And so, in time-honoured fashion, I write Nick an email asking him some questions, and this is one of the things that or a couple of the passages from that correspondence. There are lessons, I think, from within digital music practice that I think resonate with the qualities of scholarship today. So Nick writes, the lesson of this project, which was produced through a whole series of mobile phones, different computer laptop platforms, as well as iPads, as well as people. How many people was involved in it? 7. So you can imagine that's a lot of devices multiplied by 7. This is Nick. Bit rot is real. That is, while the idealization of digital files as seamless and indestructible is still prevalent, when you actually try to reconstruct or write the trace of a digital collaboration, it's almost impossible. Because file systems, software, folders, etc. are mutable. There's a reason why the Magna Carta is written on a few old sheep. Hence, writing histories of music production, which was once a matter of finding scraps of paper written by sound engineers, locating edits, searching the cutting room floor, etc., is now about navigating what are often hidden and inaccessible folders and spaces. That has implications for how historians of music are able to tell the story of music. Isn't that a fascinating thing? I mean, I think about, I've just in the last year, moved my office, hundreds, thousands probably of books, pre-digital scholarship, papers, 115 boxes that were carried from South London to the West End of Glasgow. The materials of our craft are changed and have changed. And something of what Nick was reflecting on there resonates with that too. I'm going to play you a little passage from Stuart Hall speaking shortly, and I had recorded an interview with Stuart before he died on a digital recorder, and in the run-up to a talk I gave last week at the Stuart Hall archive, I thought I'd lost the file. It wasn't a physical thing, it wasn't a material thing in the way that, you know, the old C90 cassettes were, although I lost a few of those too, I have to confess. The resources, the tools of our trade are changed in somewhat similar ways. Also, music and music life and music practice might pose questions to us as researchers. And I want to share another passage from an interview I did with Evelyn Rupert, who I showed you at the beginning on the slide. When we did our session together and Evelyn came to the interview, she brought a couple of props. Evelyn is one of the most interesting sociological writers about digital life and so-called big data. But she also had an early life as a jazz trumpeter. And when she came to the interview, which took place in London, she brought these two props. A gold mouthpiece that her partner had given her for a big birthday, and the sock that she used to stuff in the bell of the trumpet. Here's Evelyn talking about her trumpet.
And I think a lot of musicians say that I can still hold my trumpet, and it feels like an extension of yourself. And I have no other object in my life where I can pick it up and just feel like with it. It's a friend. You know, even though I can't make it sound very nice today, it's nice, and it's a comforting thing. I have it in a very prominent place in my flat. It just sits there, but it's just there. And I look at it, I walk by, and it's always there. And I know that it's as I say, it's part of my history, but it's part of who I am, and very much something I still look like an old friend sitting there. And that's a really nice feeling. So when I pulled out the sock, I hadn't pulled this out maybe in a year or so, and this piece I remember all the grueling work, with that, and that it was the only thing I had made for myself specifically for music.
Yeah. So it becomes part of you.
Yeah, it really does.
How does it become part of you, do you think?
It's not just the material. It's easy to say, well, and it's really lovely. I love the material. I spent hours shining that thing and cleaning it in the bathtub and taking it apart and reassembling it and oiling. And there's that kind of care of it too. And almost like it's a friend that you take care and you shine and you make it oiled and really work nicely and get worried if it has a new dent in it and feel bad about that, and etc. So there is that. The object matters immensely, but it's what comes out that's between you and the object that I feel. The sound, which is the two of you, together. It would be impossible for either to exist. That I think, that's amazing. That I think maybe is a good metaphor for what many of us write about as the more than human relations we have. That one could not produce that without that more than human relation. And there is, I won't use that word, people hate, agency of the trumpet, but the trumpet, if it's not well cleaned and oiled, and different trumpets make different sounds, and the way I may play it as someone else, it'll be different sound. There is something agential in it. You can't make this.
In sense of what you've just said, that we have to be realistic about what work we can do and how much work we can do.
Yeah.
Rather than just say you should do more and more and more and more and more.
No, exactly. And I got moments like this, I feel overwhelmed by both the job and work. And when you have the two, that overwhelming, I just can't add to that. I just feel I can't. I can spend my time doing other things, just more recreating myself. But this, I see it too much as it would take too much work.
And so in a way, is it kind of connecting to the work that you did in your young life that keeps that part of you that you carry around? Socially alive, say.
Knowing that's what is needed and demanded to really to recommit yourself to doing it again. So if I was to make the trumpet object and to personify it, I said, well, are you seriously, okay, come on, are you going to really, or are you just going to play with this? Are you serious or not? Or are you just going to, spend 5 minutes and put me away again? Or are you really seriously, going to reestablish this relationship?
So a couple of things just to draw out of that. I love the idea of the trumpet. Are you going to do that? Are you really going to, are you just going to touch me and put me back down, or are you going to pick me up and embrace me? I love that image, but there are a couple of serious points, I think. In a way, Evelyn's reflection, Bruno Latour would have enjoyed that reflection, I'm sure, in the relationship between the more than human and human social life. And the conceits of humanism, actually, in terms of we think that the only thing that matters in the social world are the human agents and human actors that populate it. And so the agency of the objects, as Latour would say, is very much, I think, it resonates, I think, with Evelyn's reflection on that. But there's something else that Evelyn introduces, which I think I came to realise as I was doing this project, and I've been doing it partly because it's a labour of love for a decade. Something else that's introduced that's at stake. So much of what I've said so far is a kind of tacit and maybe not so tacit or explicit argument for the value of being involved in other crafts, in the craft of doing sociology or doing any kind of critical cultural analysis. There's a value in that. But what about the pressures that are being placed on us within the day job? How much time, given the pressures of academic life and the insecurity and the precarity often for younger scholars of the position within the academy, how much time can you realistically spend? So when the trumpet says to Evelyn, are you going to pick me up? Are you going to take it seriously? I imagine, and in fact I know that Evelyn's saying, well, I would love to do that, but actually I've got another 5 references to write, I've got some lectures to plan, I've got some articles to write. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pick you up today. It introduces something that I think is about not just the relationship between sociological or cultural analysis and understanding and musical practice, but something about the nature of the academic sphere and habitus for thought and creativity. And I'm going to circle back to that at the end. One of the recent examples of an author who is making a case for the relationship between thinking with music and sociological practice itself is David Beer, who's written this book, Punk Sociology. He characterises sort of 2 contrasting trends within contemporary sociological writing. One he characterises punk sociology, sociology that is written as urgent as a clash single, or that speaks of its message clearly, and other tendencies within our discipline that verge towards an equivalent of progressive rock, and rather self-centered modes of musical expression, tracks that are on whole sides. I would be the last person alive to be churlish about that, but you get my point. Something in that I think is very interesting as a kind of challenge to us to think with. If you characterised your writing, what kind of genre would it be? Just as a playful exercise. There are some colleagues, though, who are pretty good exemplifications of punk sociology, and I want to talk a little bit about the work of Emma Jackson, who is probably one of the few sociologists who can claim to have performed at the main stage at Glastonbury, as well as teach courses in cultural theory from the lectern. Here's Emma performing with her band, Kenickie. there's Emma in the classroom too. Now, the reason why Emma's reflections are really fascinating, because in a sense, the relation between her musical life and her sociological one has a different kind of configuration to what I started with Harry Becker sitting at the piano stool in those taverns. In a way, her career as a sociologist begins after she finishes with Kenickie and has that moment of being part of, in the 90s, the Britpop moment, really. And for a band like Kenickie, fronted by Lauren Verne, who's gone on to have a very successful career as a radio journalist, fronted by 3 young women, Kenickie encountered all kinds of everyday sexism, you know, at the foot of the stage, if you like, as well as within the industry itself. You know, they had a male drummer who was often presumed to be the one who was the brains in the outfit, you know, that kind of casual sexism. Emma talks brilliantly. I was going to play you a little excerpt about her hatred of guitar shops as the place of the performance of a certain kind of masculine condescension. In a way, I think Emma says very eloquently that sociology gave her the tools to understand the gendered and classed nature of the music industry that she experienced, you know, as a teenager. I think, you know, she told me that she had to get the record contract when they were signed, countersigned by her mum, because she wasn't old enough to sign it herself as a very young person growing up in the northeast of England. But here's what she says about the value that music had for her. I think it isn't so much being a musician that has affected my sociology, but rather coming up in a localised music, where the DIY ethos was important. In the beginnings, we couldn't play very well at all, but that didn't stop us from doing gigs. So I think trying things out and wanting to experiment with writing and not worrying about it comes from that. And, you know, in a sense, well, she's written really eloquently. Although, you know, I remember when she came to Goldsmiths as an undergraduate student, she would never mention the fact that she'd had this quite, you know, serious fame. She'd been a bona fide pop star. It was obviously an experience that left her with, you know, quite considerable emotional legacy. It was an alienating experience. In a way, she wanted not to make the connection between her musical and her sociological life. She wanted something else. It was really interesting. And in recent times, she's gone back and written really quite fascinating pieces about the way in which musical moments, if you like, or the moment of Britpop is then canonised later. What she characterises as a kind of retrospective sexism that writes out all of the women that were involved in bands like Kenickie and Elastica and others from the history of that music. So in a way, Emma's contribution, or what I learned from Emma, was that in a sense that pre-sociological history that she had in the music world and in the music business was it contained sort of implicit private troubles, as C. Wright Mills would once put it. You know, there were sociological problems in that experience that weren't fully articulated or fully clear to her, and in a way, the sociological imagination has allowed her to make sense and process of that experience. It's that quality that I think musical life can have as a kind of contemplative, imaginative resource that I think is so powerful, such a rich resource. And I mentioned Stuart Hall just briefly, but there's a kind of sad coda to my this example, which I'll mention in a minute, but Stuart Hall was featured before Lauren Laverne hosted Desert Island Disc. Stuart Hall recorded the Desert Island Disc edition, chose his 8 favourite pieces of music. He talks about the sound of Miles Davis's trumpet, what it was about the sound of Miles Davis's trumpet that was so compelling to him as a young person who was born and raised in Jamaica in a society which was deeply colour conscious, as a young brown boy who felt like he was completely stifled in that colonial context. He leaves, comes as a Rhodes Scholar to London first, and then to Oxford. And the sound of Miles Davis and Miles Davis's trumpet contained the promise of not only a different life, but a different kind of relation to history and self.
Well, I suppose when I was about 19 or 20, I would say Miles Davis put his finger on my soul. The various moods of Miles Davis have matched the sort of evolution of my own feelings. They continue to be a regret for the loss of a life which I might have lived but didn't live. I could have gone back, I could have been a Caribbean person. I'm not that anymore. I can't ever be English in the full sense, though I know and understand the British from the inside like the back of my hand. So I'm a sort of diaspora person. And the uncertainty, the restlessness, and some of the nostalgia for what cannot be is in the sound of Miles Davis's trumpet.
culture and a society which he was both at home in and could never be at home. And there's something very poignant about that. I mean, it's hard to listen to that passage for me. I had this wonderful opportunity to sit down with Stuart and record an interview, the one that I thought I'd lost. Remember, we'd promised to have a second conversation about music, about his love of modern jazz, what it was about that for a diaspora intellectual to have left the Caribbean and made a home in which he could never truly belong, and the longing in those tones for a modern experience that would both be productive and creative at the same time, an opportunity to think differently. We never had that conversation. In fact, I wrote to him the weekend he died saying, Stuart, should we have that conversation? I got a message from his partner, Catherine Hall, saying, Stuart's in hospital at the moment. He's hoping to see friends when he gets out, and he died 2 days later. So there's a kind of poignance in that. It's just reflecting on it. But, there was something about, I think, Stuart's relation to music. He could play the piano, not in a sort of, he wasn't wasn't a particularly accomplished player, but he had that feel for music. I want to come to a close and kind of come back really to the points that Evelyn Rupert touches on. And one of the interviews that I did right at the very end of this project was with Clive Nwonka, who's written this very brilliant book called Black Boys, which is a kind of history of contemporary film and race. Clive was a lover of music, could play the guitar really well, but he told me when we did our interview online during COVID that him stopping playing the guitar coincided almost exactly with him beginning his PhD. And it speaks, I think, to the pressure that many people feel now, and I wonder if this resonates with anyone in the room, particularly for those voices that are trying to find a new kind of space and home within the academy. The pressure that's part of that experience about having to kind of, in a way, both secure a tenure in a world which may not be that hospitable. So Clive commented in that interview, for myself as a black British academic who works in a very white field, the academic journey is like, I guess, snakes and ladders. In like, you can get to there, but one false move and you're back to square one again. There's something about the precarity of that experience that I think winnows the sociological imagination and also limits the sense of being able to take the risk on keeping your foot in another sphere of cultural and social life. You know, it's the limitations, I think, of both specialisation and professionalisation in our time. And I think that's a risk. I think that's a deep risk. It's a risk that isn't borne equally either. It's for those young colleagues who are in many respects the first in their families and generation to walk into and to occupy the world of the university, for whom that risk seems highest. Now, I don't want to argue that necessarily being a musician necessarily makes one a better sociological listener. I'm sure some of the musicians in the audience will think, well, actually, I'm not sure some of my musical colleagues are particularly good listeners. Yeah, Phil's laughing. Doesn't necessarily make you a good listener. But I think there's something about this kind of double movement, this double kind of investment in thinking in and across the world of ideas and in and across the world of musicking and music making, that I think has been a nourishing relation for many, many people. It's a relation that I think is being challenged in our time because of the institutionalization of knowledge and the pressure that the modern university imposes on young scholars. But I don't want to idealize musicking and music making, because this wonderful book by Sally Ann Gross and George Musgrove is a very cautionary tale. Can music make you sick? This is how they describe contemporary lives in music. The intersection of financial precarity, entrepreneurial individualism, the struggle to define work boundaries lead to musicians struggling to know when to stop working, trapping them in a reflexive loop of production and debt that affects all social relations and impacts their sense of self in ways they describe as distressing. You could take the word musician out of there, couldn't you, and put academic? You could. So I don't want to make a sort of simplistic contrast. I mean, I think in many ways these are challenges for all people involved in cultural work, as Du Bois would say. Well, listen, thank you for listening so attentively. I just want to make a few points in conclusion, and then we'll still have a little bit of time for questions. Yes. So here's some of my headline points that I want you just to go over again. Like I say, I think there are sociological uses that music afford, as well as I think there might be uses for musicians and people involved in music that sociology may be able to offer. 5 main points. I think that the invitation of musicking and being involved in music, regardless of what the genre is, regardless of what the sphere of musical life we're talking about, is the opportunity to be involved and experience an alternative world of value and values. There's something that I think Emma Jackson learns as she goes into the guitar shop, even though it's a painful one, that affords that. It's also a different lesson, but has in a similar key, to the lesson that Howard Becker takes from that experience as a 15-year-old, where everybody went, because he wasn't legally supposed to be there, at the school, at the piano school, playing in those taverns in the 1940s. There's also an opportunity, I think, to listen beyond words and to be attentive to the way in which culture and society unfolds that isn't necessarily narrated, that isn't spoken of, but operates within the world or textures of feel, of touch, of tone. As Zygmunt Bauman once commented, isn't it true that most of the important things in life, in our experience of life, remain unsaid? I think that's what Kath Larkin is reaching for when she writes her fieldwork songs, for the unsaid, for the unspoken. The third point, this relation can foster an attention to the inchoate, the not yet, the potentially hopeful. And that lends itself, I think, and there's a reason why I think people like Paul Gilroy and also Stuart Hall use references to music to invoke utopian movements of imagination. And I think that goes right back to Du Bois when he says, it's the articulate message of the slave to the world is in those gospel songs. One of the participants in the project too said that for her, her musical life was a kind of invitation or injunction to be braver in her thinking and her thoughts. And I think that there's something there which is very profound. A braver sociology may be on offer in that space, that dialogue, that space of those double movements. And lastly, all of those possibilities are operating in a sphere where there are constraints of professionalism, specialism, and audit. Do you have the time? I don't have the time, often people said in interviews. A bit like Evelyn Rupert's trumpet, who asks, are you going to pick me up? Very often she was unable to. But somehow the presence, that physical presence, was a reminder, I think, to Evelyn and to others of the potential that might be afforded through music to a different kind of imagination, a different kind of feel for the social world. Thanks very much for listening.